Hi, how's it going? My name is Juno, and you?
Hi, Juno. I'm Andrew Van Way.
Nice to meet you today. So, today we are talking about the books that you have written. And how many books have you written?
Let's see. I think I'm up to about six now. I believe six books. Yeah, and seventh is coming out in about another month and a half.
That's awesome. And which of those books have been your favorite to write?
Well, they've all been my favorite at the time and my least favorite at the time as well. Paradoxically, I find that when I'm writing one of them, I have to kind of fall in love during the process, but it's also pretty painful. There's a lot of doubt. So usually it depends on the day that you get me. If I'm having a good writing day, I love it. If I'm having a terrible writing day, I will tell you that this is going to be the end of it and I should probably just take up basket weaving or something. So I would say that right now, my favorite is Tides of Darkness, which I just finished, and it's in the final stages of being laid out and everything. That's the one that's coming out in about 6 weeks. Prior to that, it was By the Light of Dead Stars, which is the first book in that series. And then before that, it was Head Like a Hole, which I think is one of my more popular books. I think people tend to know me
I
from
have
that
that right
one
here
the
too.
most. Yeah, okay. So that's the one that I think got a lot of attention last year. It really just depends, it really depends where I am in the process. If I'm looking back and excited about something that I've created, the 3 books ago was my favorite. If I'm really excited about where the story is going, like By the Light of Dead Stars, then that's my favorite. So that's a roundabout way to answer your question and not really answer your question. I'm sorry.
It's all good. And your genre of writing is horror, right?
I stick mostly to horror. I do have a techno thriller series that kind of straddles the edge between a thriller, horror, a little bit of sci-fi, but all of my stuff has an element of darkness in it. Absolutely.
So, what got you into the genre of horror?
Wow. Probably my childhood. I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and Stephen King was just like what kids read. I saw this meme the other day where it said, behind every Gen Xer and their kind of weird darkness is a Stephen King book that they read way too early. And I literally read Pet Cemetery, I think in 1988 when I was like 8 years old. And that just scarred me for life. But it also kind of taught me to confront the darkness out there. That's, the darkness on the page, the darkness in the world. It taught me to overcome some of the ghosts and the demons, fictional or realistic. So horror has always kind of been a way that I've sought to kind of understand the world and to kind of get the courage, to trudge through the darkness that we do see day to day out there.
I love that. I'm absolutely a horror fan myself. So would you say Stephen King was one of your big influences in life?
Sure. Yeah, King, Dean Koontz, of course. During the 80s, it was Dean Koontz, King, Clive Barker, Richard Matheson. There were, the 80s was just filled with like trashy VHS movies and horror movies that you could get off the shelf, the 90s as well. Grady Hendrix has made this great career out of kind of shining a light on these lesser known paperbacks from like the 70s and 80s. So there's too many to count. It was just that kind of everywhere you went, something was influenced by horror back then. And that high watermark kind of faded, I feel like, in the mid 90s. But yeah, it was absolutely, growing up and Goosebumps. I kind of was a little too old for Goosebumps when they came out. Because I was in high school and it wasn't really cool to read Goosebumps at the time, although I realize how stupid that is now because I went back and reread them and they're amazing. But yeah, R.L. Stein was kind of at the tail end of those influences.
I'm pretty sure Goosebumps is what started my horror
There you
love,
go.
to be honest.
Yeah, my younger sister, who's 8 years under me, she's the same way. I mean, she just Goosebumps was what got her started. I feel like in the 70s and 80s, there wasn't really that kind of YA genre as R.L. Stein kind of defined it for like horror. As much as there was. So we kind of got like the full fire hose, whereas I feel like, a generation behind kind of got like eased into it with Goosebumps and then got like the Stephen King and Clive Barker and those kind of books and whatnot. I'm envious because I kind of had to sneak those books off the bookshelf.
So what would you say is your day-to-day writing process?
Wow. It's a lot of self-doubt and it's a lot of walking around and looking absolutely insane as I talk to myself and I kind of mumble. And I do this full time. So this is my little like writing cave. I've converted a walk-in closet into maybe like a 9 foot by 5 foot little dungeon that I can kind of write in on focused and focus. So it would vary depending on where I am in the project. So if I'm starting a brand new project, I usually do a lot of dictation. I take a lot of notes. I write my first drafts by longhand, so I have a lot of pens and inks and paper around me. So I'll just be jotting down a lot of ideas. I kind of have to fall in love with an idea because I know I'm going to be spending months or years with that idea. So I have to kind of explore it. I have to get an ending. It's like planning a road trip. I almost have to know where I'm going. I have to have like some destinations along the way. So if we're heading to DC and we're leaving from Los Angeles, I'm like, all right, we got to hit Colorado, we got to do Texas, Chicago, and I kind of plan for that, but I'm not a plotter in the sense that I don't know every single page and every single part of the story. I want the characters and the plot. I want it all to kind of surprise me at moments, because if it doesn't surprise me, I'm not sure it's going to surprise the reader. And so that's why I kind of, once I get that feeling and that momentum up there, that's when I do a first draft. Sometimes that can just be a week later. Sometimes it takes several months to get to that point. Every book is kind of its own battle. So I don't feel like I'm at the point in my career where I can say like, this is exactly what I do. Some books I've like sat down and I've Head Like a Hole, for example, is a book that probably came out. It took 10 years to think of the idea, but the actual writing, I feel like, was like 100 days. It was like just like I hit like one draft in like 30 days and then revised and revised and revised. And maybe like a season and a half later, I was at the book that you've read. Whereas other books, it takes a long time to kind of just write my way down some false hallways or make a few mistakes here and there and double back and figure out what doesn't work. Again, that's another roundabout way to say that I don't know. There's a complete different process for each book. If I was more organized, I would have a perfect answer for you, but I'm afraid I don't.
It's all good. And actually, one of our comments was going to be kind of my next question. It says here, how did you come up with the idea for Head Like a Hole? My question was going to be, how do you come up with your ideas for your books?
So yeah, the ideas, I feel like I have 1,000 ideas. I have 10,000 ideas, and I'm going to die before all my ideas, or even most of my ideas, are ever fully formed. The idea is kind of the initial spark, and then I have to actually have the characters and the situation, and it has to kind of evolve. The best way I can kind of describe it is like a metaphor where, like, you get like the lightning strikes, and then it creates a little bit of heat. And if there's enough heat and enough environment and conducive things, then it keeps going and it becomes a wildfire. With Head Like a Hole, I wanted a story set in the 90s because I'm at that age where I'm starting to feel a little bit of nostalgia for that time. Sometimes I get a little seduced by the idea of like, well, weren't things simpler back then? And no, they weren't simpler. They were just different. We didn't have cell phones, but we had other problems. Um, I also wanted something to kind of be an homage to all the 90s tropes. Scream, I Know What You Did Last Summer, body horror, cheap VHS movies where, friends are harboring a dark secret. There was a great movie called Body Parts by, I forget the director's name, but Jeffrey Fahey was in it. He also played the Lawnmower Man in the movie The Lawnmower Man. And it was about a guy who gets in a car accident and his arm gets ripped off and he gets someone else's arm and that arm is donated to him. But that arm starts having these weird compulsions. And it turns out the arm came from a serial killer. And there's other people who've had other parts donated. A guy got his legs from the same serial killer. And it's this silly idea, but the movie takes it deadly seriously. So that was an influence. The Ring was a huge influence, the Japanese version. So all of those things kind of harmonized together. And I just saw this image of this fisherman dredging up crabs. And he was a down on his luck guy pulling a crab trap up You know, after 5 or 6 traps were completely empty, this guy's poaching off season. He's getting these crabs in a foggy New England cove, and there's a head in there. And it's a human head. There's nothing else. And, you know, of course, that's an awful image, but my horror writer brain goes, what's like the weirdest thing that this head could do? Well, it can open its eyes and it can try to talk. And then my brain was just like, ah, shit, we got to figure out where this story goes. And I knew that it was going to connect to a group of friends. I knew that it was going to connect to the 90s. I needed a framing device as a person being interviewed back then, because nostalgia was really important to the story. Nostalgia and memories, how our memories change over 30 years. So that's how the idea of Head Like a Hole came about. You know, there were a lot of different kind of directions I could have taken it in, but the final version that you read for me felt like the most organic version of that idea. As weird and wild as it is, it was just one of those stories that, like, I knew where it was going to end. I knew a couple roadmaps along the way. And boy, once I hit the ground running, like, I couldn't stop writing.
I absolutely love stories that like horror stories that take place in the 90s. I don't know what it is about it, but it's just so much more entertaining, to be honest.
Yeah, it's, you know, first of all, you can use phones, but cell phones were not nearly as common back then. You had to have that rich friend or that friend who like carried around a big ass phone. So depending on where in the 90s you were, it could be like you're not going to be able to solve this mystery by just grabbing your smartphone and Googling the answer. You've got to be a lot more resourceful. You've got to go to the library. You've got to get like information from other people. You've got to put that information together. And you know, it was hard to get together with friends in the 90s. I think a lot of people forget that, like, you had to call their house and their house had one phone number, and you were going to get through their parents, and you had to talk to their parents. Like, especially if you were like in middle school or high school, you're just like, you couldn't say like, hi, Mrs. Smith, you know, is Bobby there? You had to actually go through a routine and chat with Mrs. Smith's mom, Mr. Smith's mom, or Bobby's mom. And there was this filter of communication that made it so much harder to dig up information that nowadays, you know, if you're going to set a horror novel in 2024, people are just going to Google, like, well, how do I kill this kind of monster? And they're going to ask ChatGPT, and it's going to give them a ton of the answers. So it makes the storytelling much more on the characters and communicating. And there's a lot more opportunity for deception. There's a lot more opportunity for tension and the uncovering of information. You know, that's one of the things about the information age that we live in right now that can kind of be a bummer, is that it takes away that investigative element that I think is so fascinating and important for horror novels.
And speaking on research, how much research do you think you put into making a book?
It really depends on the subject. I would say that I put in way too much research. I have a lot of, not necessarily beta readers, but subject area experts that I've worked with over the years. I have 2 FBI agents. I have a couple friends that are former police investigator, former SWAT operators. I have, you know, I was able to go and watch an autopsy live for another book that I wrote in 2019. So I've got a lot of different people that have been very generous with their knowledge, and I ask them a lot of questions, and I get really curious. I've got another bookshelf in the other room that's all on quantum physics and marine biology and anatomy and stuff like that. So I probably over research, but for me, part of the joy of writing a story is learning about it. And I wouldn't want to do a story that I didn't over research. So for example, you know, with Oksana in Head Like a Hole, it took me down bizarre side quests where I was learning about cellular mutation and all sorts of, you know, autopsy scenes and things like that. And I don't think that that would, I'd say 85% of that doesn't end out in the novel. But the stuff that does end out in the novel, I think, is pretty fascinating. And it takes the story in a really weird way. And there's a lot of opportunities that I feel like other writers, if they don't research a story, if they don't put a lot of that effort in, they miss these really interesting opportunities to tell not only an authentic story, but an original story, a story that's different. We've all seen like the SWAT team kick in the door and throw flashbangs. And, you know, you've seen the investigator arrive on the scene and say that they're going to take over the scene from the locals. They don't know what they're doing. But those are cliches, and they generally never happen. Like, you know, the SWAT teams, when they kick in a door, they have like 3 different ways that they can go through the door. And those 3 different ways depend on the situation and the threats that they might have inside that situation. And that allows you to have a lot more drama and a lot more conflict in a scene. And, you know, maybe a lot of readers won't notice that, but the readers that are familiar with that appreciate it. And the readers that have been there will kind of appreciate that you take the extra time and ask them. In fact, actually, I got an email the other day from a reader who had read By the Light of Dead Stars. And he said, hey, listen, I was a former Marine, and you mentioned a Ka-Bar knife, and you mentioned the tip and the type of metal used in this knife that this character uses. Like, are you a knife nut? Because I'm a knife nut, man. Like, where do you read about this? I was like, actually, I'm not a knife nut. But I asked a couple of my friends who were former Marines, who were former military, who were former police, who are knife nuts. Like, hey, man, there's this kid that's going to get this knife that, like, it's going to do some damage in the story. Help me kind of figure out what knife is going to be usable. And so they just sent me back this, and I went down a rabbit hole where I was asking this question on a forum. I think it was called like the Blade Forum. And that's one of the fun parts of writing that I absolutely love. And I hope and I wish more writers did that, because I think it can take your story in some really unique directions.
I agree. I definitely love it when authors put in like all the research into their books. It makes it so much more entertaining and feels more real.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you know,
Yeah.
like a lot of when you're watching movies, there's things that you look and you're like, oh no, that wouldn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
And you can just get that sense of like that wouldn't happen in real life.
Exactly. And I think that there's a lot of times where it can feel a little bit more boring that they're doing things like they would authentically do it. Like the book Silence of the Lambs. You know, we've all seen that movie and read that book, but like it's kind of a masterclass on someone who's just really competent and doing her job well. Clarice Starling doesn't like go rogue and, get her, kick in the door and have this big blowout. No, she's just methodically doing her job really, really well. And that's how she gets Buffalo Bill. Whereas everyone else is kind of going off on this detour. But she's the one that's just, she's just checking the boxes and doing that. It's something that's exciting, seeing people that are really competent doing their job. I think sci-fi, like Andy Weir with like The Martian and Project Hail Mary, he writes these books that are about people that are just like kind of methodically going through their job. But there's, so much opportunity for drama and tension and interesting stories when you have protagonists that are like that.
Definitely. And what do you think makes a successful story?
Wow. I don't know. To be perfectly honest, I think it's different with every reader. Some readers will read one book and say that was boring as hell, and another reader will read that book and say it's profound. It touched my life. It was so incredibly unique. I think part of it is luck. The reader has to kind of meet the book at the right time of their life, and I know I realize I'm putting part of that on the reader. But there's books that I've read when I was in, high school that I just didn't click with, and that I went back and read them 20 years later, and I had the life experience to understand the characters more or the nuances of the situations more. So I think that part of what makes a story successful is the reader, having to kind of trust the author and having to kind of have the empathy and imagination to meet that story at a point in their life where they're receptive to that message. And I've certainly read books plenty of times where I didn't like it at the time, or I loved it at the time, but then I came back later and I'm like, oh, maybe I don't connect with this at this point in my life right now. On the opposite of that is craft. I love a well-written story. So if the sentences pop, if the paragraphs are beautiful, if the author put in the effort to convey an idea in their own voice, that to me is one of the most exciting things, because it's intimate. You've got someone's words in your brain. it's like the closest thing that you could emotionally do to another person in a way is put their words through your eyes or ears, however you consume a story, and just kind of both of you go on this journey together. So yeah, the way the sentences and the paragraphs are constructed, pacing, there's a lot of components that go into it. But I would say that, you know, the author's voice is very important as well. I think more important than people realize, because you're spending, you know, 8 to 10 hours. My books are 400 pages, 500 pages. They're long. You're spending that amount of time with me. You know, I hope that you're going to feel that like I have tried to craft a story that is unique, that I'm not just, hey, here's, you know, beginning, a middle, and an end, and a couple weird things happen along the way, and, you know, pay me $20. I, you know, would hope that you, at least at a subconscious level, feel that I've tried to revise it as best as I could at the time that I made that book.
So can I ask, what age did you start like writing horror?
Honestly, I've been writing horror since third grade. I wrote short stories. I got in trouble because I did a book report on a Stephen King book, The Dark Tower. I wrote a short story in middle school in sixth grade about some kids that went on a camping trip and go in a cave and meet a dead ghost of an Indian princess, and she slaughters them. I mean, it had no story whatsoever, but my teacher was like, you guys just have to write a story. So I gave him 10 pages written out on my grandmother's typewriter, you know, first draft, mistakes and everything. So I've been writing all my life. It's just one of those things that's like, you know, some people draw even before they're an artist. It's just how it's a compulsion they do. Storytelling has always been a compulsion that I've had because it helps me analyze my own thoughts. It helps me kind of order my thoughts. It helps me, you know, put order to the chaos of the world that we're all in, because the world doesn't have stories in it. It feels like it has stories, but it really just depends where you enter and exit. Because you could be halfway through someone's story and they die and there's no resolution to that, and that's that. So I've been doing this my whole life. If you're asking professionally, how long have I been doing it? I was a screenwriter in my 20s, and that was when I was writing for film. And then I transitioned into books in my 30s, and I'm in my 40s now. So, you know, I've been doing this, I've been paid for this for probably about 20 years.
I'm kind of similar. I started writing a horror book in third grade as well. It was about a haunted
Perfect.
pumpkin.
Yeah, it's
I
funny.
still have it somewhere.
That's great. Third grade is like, I feel like a lot of people that's when their brain comes online and their fear centers start popping out, and we, you know, start exploring that ghostly
Mm,
aspect of things. There's got to be something about third grade, because I've talked to a lot of people that have had the same experience.
it's awesome. Oh, and it seems like we have a comment here. It says, how do you feel about the Dark Tower series?
Wow. I actually had a great discussion about the Dark Tower series with a bunch of other writers when I was at this conference in Virginia a couple weeks ago. Um, I I love it. I think it's Stephen King's magnum opus series. It does take a few curious detours. I think there's that book 4 that maybe is a whole flashback in and of itself. And then yeah, Stephen King becomes a character in it. It it was a series that I think was written over like 30 years. I think he started it in the 80s and then finished it up in like the mid 2000s, 2005 or 2004. I have to go back and reread it before I can make another assessment again. But I have very fond feelings about it. It was written maybe a little differently than I might have written it or expected it, but it's a Stephen King book. You know, you're always going to go for like a ride, whatever it is.
It's understandable. I like Stephen King's movies, but his books do tend to be a little bit long.
Yeah, he's kind of that generation that was paid probably by the word back in the day when they were getting started. So his books, especially by contemporary standards, I think his books are a little bit longer. For me, one of the things that I enjoy about Stephen King is that he takes a long time to kind of just lay out the world and get you really invested in the characters. And even though something awful is going to happen to them, that horror is ratcheted up because these are real people. These are people that you care about, and they have real lives. And it was like I was rereading Pet Sematary recently, and so much of that book is just kind of people going about their day-to-day stuff and dealing with a bee sting on a 3-year-old kid and things like that. And these are things that I think, my instinct these days, if I was writing it in 2024, would be to kind of like remove it. But at the same time, so much of that works by getting you invested in this family before all hell rains down on them. So yeah, Stephen King, he can take a while to get to those points, just like I can sometimes.
So how do you balance building suspense with delivering shocks and scares in your story?
That's a good question. I don't know if I do it consciously or subconsciously. I feel like if you have shocks and scares all the time, it doesn't really matter. It's like if everything is fast, nothing is fast. But at the same time, I feel like you kind of need a good hook at the beginning of a story, especially these days where people are reading the first 5% on their Kindle, or they're just kind of browsing it on Amazon to kind of see like, hey, is this story, what's going to happen here? So I feel like, you need to kind of be you need to be quick at the beginning and kind of rope people in. But at the same time, you also have to have an ebb and a flow to your story. I read a lot of stories that come from like, creepypasta and like Reddit no sleep and stuff like that. And while I like them as stories that are written online, I don't like them as novels. And I feel that there's like a lot of authors who kind of think that like, oh, if they can just like hit all gas, the whole time, it's going to be scarier and scarier. Like, no, it's not actually. It doesn't work like that. Like Midsummer as a movie works so well because it shocks you at the beginning, but then it lulls you into this sense of like community. And there's still, there's still drama and there's still conflict, but it takes a good hour for the horror to ramp up again. There's the implication that there's horror in the background. And I think a good book does that as well. It's like a good song. It might hit you really quickly at the beginning or pull you in at the beginning and then kind of tease you and take its time. So I think you have to kind of find a balance. It depends on the story you want to tell too. Some authors are really good at telling a fast-paced story. Blake Crouch is an example of an author that I adore, and some of his books just hit the gas from page one. Like one of his books called Run is about, everyone in the United States who witnessed an aurora starts going crazy and killing everyone who didn't witness the aurora. And it's just that concept starts on page one when it's like the purge of the people who didn't witness the aurora. And the whole book is people just running from the other people. It's like Mad Max. It's this nonstop thing. But even he paces it out where, you have these rest stops, you have these little breaks where you can catch your breath. And I think that's what, what good writers do, is that they know that they can present that drama. They can hit you with everything, but they also need to kind of tease you and slow things down a little bit.
So speaking on that, do you have any tips on how to pace your book the best you can?
I would say when you're revising your book, go back and if you can, use different colored highlighters and just kind of go through. If you've got like, for example, three highlighter colors, let's just say you've got yellow, you've got orange, and you've got red. I would say like the parts of your book that you think are kind of like a 1 out of 3 on the suspense level or the level of tension, highlight those parts with a 1. And the parts that are a 3, where like, man, this is the craziest stuff, this cannot get any worse, highlight those with the red. And then the orange, the stuff that's kind of in the middle. And that can help you visually figure out, do I have enough of these breather moments? Or is my book just all like, if it's all red, it's not going to feel like that way. Like readers can't get that interested if it's 50 pages of absolute chaos, unless those 50 pages happen like towards the end of the story. So I think, you just try to figure out how you can pace it. Color coding really helps me. I'm a very visual person. I do a lot of note cards too. So I'll take note cards where I'll write out just a couple sentences for each chapter and I'll lay them out on the ground and I'll just kind of pace around and look down. And if I see that, like, a lot of my note cards are action, 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 I know that I've kind of got a problem and I need to have some character development. I need to have some little introspective moments. Even in a tense scene, you can stop and have the characters reflect on something. Silence of the Lambs is a great example. Back to Thomas Harris. At the end of Silence of the Lambs, Clarice Starling is in the basement of a serial killer's house, and she's in complete darkness, and the killer is putting on his night vision goggles. But it jumps to her head, and it has these moments where she's just kind of thinking and calming things down, because otherwise that scene is just going to read too quickly. So I think if you balance the internal moments of the character, if you balance, the action, it can have a natural elongating effect that can make readers absolutely invested. And because at the end of the day, that's what reading is we're trying to get inside someone else's head and see the world through their perspective. And what can be more interesting than seeing the world through a character's perspective when they're in a moment of heightened tension and when they're scared, when they're being hunted by Buffalo Bill through a dark basement. He's wearing night vision goggles and she isn't. That for me, it sounds terrifying, but it's also exciting to be able to experience that vicariously.
That's awesome. And how do you develop your characters, particularly with villains and monsters? What do you think makes an effective horror and antagonist?
I think that in a lot of ways, they have to be the opposite of the protagonist. So they almost have to kind of be inversions of each other. In Head Like a Hole, the characters are kind of inversions of each other, although they have a lot of similarities. In By the Light of Dead Stars, the first book is about dealing with grief and trauma. And you've got a 13-year-old girl who lost her family, and you've got a 19-year-old boy who had an accident at a university in a fraternity hazing ritual and was traumatized and almost died. Technically did die. And how they are both dealing with that trauma is how the story kind of dovetails their storylines together. They barely meet in this novel until the big climax. But I think that in a lot of ways, the hero and the villain have to almost kind of they have to be on a similar journey. They just have to take different choices and different decisions. They might want the exact same thing out of it, or they might have the same pressure on them. But one person is making decisions that we can empathize with, and the other person is making decisions that maybe we can understand, but we don't want. They're not the right decisions. So yeah, I think they have to, in a way, even if they don't meet up, they have to, in a way, play off of each other, almost like, in inversions, dark paths of what could have happened if this character did Y instead of X. I hope that makes sense.
Definitely. That's one of the things I do like about heroes and villains is that you would see two people going through the same thing, but one person chooses to go on a good side, while the other person might not.
Absolutely. And sometimes it can just be as simple as, the villain is making the same decision of the hero, but they're coming from a part that they didn't have. They didn't have the Obi-Wan Kenobi in their life at the right moments. They didn't have the mentor figure, or they didn't have, whatever the guidance was. I mean, going back to like Harry Potter and whatnot, Harry Potter had all these great people to help him. Voldemort didn't, but in a lot of ways they're very similar and entangled. And I think that makes for an effective villain, a memorable villain, and a villain that feels human, or at least relatable. That we can kind of see them and think, wow, there is a little bit there to pity, as evil as they are.
That's great. And characters definitely help make a good story, but I think another thing that helps is the settings. So, how do you choose and develop the setting for your story?
I think the setting is just as important in many ways as the character. It's a vibe that kind of flows through the story in the background. It's like the third character in the room. You've got the heroes, you've got the villains, and then you've got the setting. And the setting has to almost be at this low level implied in everything. So, for example, in my By the Light of Dead Stars, my Beyond the Lost Coast series, it's this small coastal town in Northern California on an area that's called the Lost Coast. It's a real part of California that's just steeped in history and lore. There's ancient redwoods. There's, timber industries and mining. It's this area that a lot of people went to, back in the 50s and 60s and kind of moved away from the big cities. And there's been this sort of feeling and animosity there in the background as new people move out there. It's also kind of a region that's foggy. It's beautiful. I mean, the nature is just incredible. So the setting for that story has to kind of play into everything, not just visually, but a low level tension, the tension of a new family moving there. This is a family that they're outsiders. And so even though people don't say, hey, you're an outsider, you're not part of us, there is that kind of tension there. There's that dynamic, and that helps with the setting. It can also be, someone who's lonely, a 13-year-old girl who just lost her family, goes out and, stands on the cliffs and is looking at a foggy beach in Northern California and feeling alone. That visual can, play off. Even though books are a mental medium, our brain still conjures up an image of, a young teenage girl at a vulnerable moment in her life looking at this foggy beach and these waves, and we don't really kind of know what's going through her mind, but we can imagine it. So the setting is that kind of third wheel, that's that third character that's silent.
I definitely agree. I love a good setting. What do you hope readers take away from your book when they're reading it?
What do I hope they take away from it? That's a really good question, and I hope that they just, at the very least, are entertained, because there's a lot of things that we could spend, 8 or 10 hours of our day with. It could be social media, it could be video games, it could be movies, scrolling on, Twitter and TikTok. And there's a lot of things like that. I hope at the bare minimum, they're entertained. And that's all I've kind of ever want to do beyond the entertainment. I do hope that, horror teaches you skills to deal with the real horror in the world. And there's not necessarily Pennywise out there, but there's cancer. There's not, monsters, but there are cruel people. There are moments in your life that you're going to have to stand up to something that you don't quite understand, or it's going to take a tremendous amount of personal strength. You might have an abusive spouse. You might grow up in a family of religious extremism that you're not feeling that way. You might, deal with racism or bullies or things like that. So I do hope that, when you read one of my books, it gives you a little bit of strength to find the monsters, if there are monsters in your own life, and to realize that, you can fight them too. If a bunch of kids in Stephen King's It can go into the sewers and fight an intergalactic clown that's been eating people for, thousands of years, I think, you could probably stand up to the schoolyard bullies, or you could stand up to a terrible boss, or you might be able to have the fortitude to survive a situation that might otherwise be soul crushing.
I love that. And definitely same thoughts. It's amazing. How do you handle criticism and feedback about your book?
I think it depends where it comes from, really. I think that, everyone's got their own opinion, and of course, everyone's entitled to their own opinion. I write my books for a very specific type of reader, and some people are going to like them and some people aren't. If you can't sit down and focus on my book, if you're driven and compulsive, if you need, chapters that are 800 words, my books might not be for you. So I try to contextualize the criticism where it comes from. And to be honest, I don't really listen to much criticism, not because I am tender, but because I find that, it really depends on where it comes from. If it's coming from an author friend who can give me a suggestion like, hey, this chapter didn't work because of X, Y, and Z. Here's how we could fix it. That would be one thing. If it comes from a reader, hey, I didn't like the way this character portrayed, 13-year-old girls or something like that, that can be valuable and it can absolutely help me. At the same time, I think it just depends on where it comes from. Everyone meets a book at a different time in their life, like I said earlier. And maybe the story of a fisherman dredging up a severed head that opens its eyes in 1990s New England might not hit you in your 20s, but it might hit you in your 40s when you're looking back on a time in your life when you had friends in high school that you're nostalgic for, and you wonder if you're ever going to have friends like that again. So I think it really depends on where it comes from. I think it depends on how well intentioned it is. But at the end of the day, I don't really pay attention to a lot of criticism because 9 times out of 10, the book's already out there and I'm 2 books ahead. If I did make a factual error, by all means, call me out on that. Like if I have one of the things I did in one of my early books that my buddy called me out on was he was like, you put a silencer on a 38 special. And I don't know if you know much about guns, but a 38 special is a revolver and a silencer goes on the front. And it's not going to make any sense because the sound on a revolver comes out the side as well as the front. So it's just like putting a suppressor or something that's going to silence it. And I went back and I fixed that immediately because that is a total mistake. But at the end of the day, those things those are legitimate criticisms that I do try to fix, especially if it's a factual mistake. If I put a town in the wrong place, oh my God, I'll try to fix that as fast as I can.
That's great. And as a writer, what are some of the biggest challenges you face when you're writing this horror?
When I'm writing this horror, horror is a challenging genre to write because what scares people is very personal and different. Some people might be scared of a clown that is living in the sewers. Some people might be scared of a ghost. Some people might come from a religious upbringing that scares them of a particular demon or has a particular number that is cursed or things like that. So I think that it just depends on what it is you're trying to achieve with that. I think that it's a challenge. And I think that every situation is different. You have to kind of approach it differently. If I could give one answer, I would be following it every time, but unfortunately I can't.
That makes sense. It's probably also why a lot of horror movies don't fully scare me.
Yeah, and horror movies, they can rely on jump scares. You can, if you're kind of not able to get them and scare them with the idea, you can at least hit them with some noise. You can have the cat kind of pop out at a moment, and that'll at least get some of the audience's heart racing. So I think that, it's one of those things where books, we have to be a little bit more subtle about that. And it takes a little bit more to kind of get underneath people's skin. I think at the end of the day, for me, like if the characters aren't interesting and fascinating, and if the idea isn't compelling, you can hit me with as much ghosts and creepy things as possible. But, I want the tension of knowing what the hell is going to happen to this character that I like.
And now that we talked about challenges, what do you find rewarding about writing horror?
Oh, wow. There's so many things. I wouldn't do this if I didn't find that this was just insanely rewarding. On a personal level, going through my own demons. I mean, you all get to read my nightmares. Like Head Like a Hole, I couldn't have written that when I was in my 20s. I had to cross over into my 40s and almost hit like midlife because nostalgia was such an important part of that story. Memories were such an important part of that story to me. And when you get, 30s and 40s, your memory starts kind of playing tricks on you. You can actually have a conversation with a couple friends and you can all remember the same event differently. And that's what's really weird is like, there's no way for you to guys to figure out who is exactly right because your memories are, every time you recall an event, you're rewriting that event as well. It's like recording a movie or a video cassette. You kind of go over it again and again. So that's one of the things that it's one of the things that I work through with my books. I work through my own demons, and you get to kind of explore that with me as well. So that's one of the joys of it. Surprising myself, connecting with readers too. I mean, just moments like this, being able to chat with other people around the world, having the privilege of people spending their time with my words. And I realize how, that sounds, but we're in a world of easy distraction. I mean, we can scroll TikTok for 12 hours and just see people around the world doing things, but you're sitting down with my words on a page or on your Kindle or in your ear through an audiobook. That's intimate. I appreciate that. And I appreciate, even if you didn't like it, I appreciate that you spent the time with it. And I hope that you got value out of it. At the very least, I hope you were entertained. And that's one of the true joys of it, getting a message. Hey man, Read by the Light of Dead Stars. It hit me at the right time in my life because my dad died and I was struggling with grief as well. And if Zelda can deal with her grief, I can deal with my grief. And I just needed a good, happy cry like Zelda got in that book. And I'm ready to fight my demons just like she is.
I love that. And we have a question from the comments. Do you ever scare yourself while writing? Do you find any topic so disturbing that you have stopped and put it away for a while?
Yeah, I definitely scare myself during writing. Absolutely. There's a lot of times that it's just a sense of dread, um, an underlying sense of dread that something bad is going to happen. And sometimes I know that a character is going to get something and it's going to be a monkey's paw moment where they're going to get what they want, but it's going to turn out in a really twisted way. So the anticipation of how that's going to play out absolutely scares me. Sometimes it is just a moment that a moment that I didn't anticipate happens as well. There have been moments where I've literally scared myself because I was writing a scene in one direction and a character did something different. And I realized that they have kind of taken control. And I know that that sounds a little psychotic, but when the character actually comes alive and is sort of using me as a vehicle to tell the story, that's the best feeling in the world. But it's also really unsettling because I feel like I'm the character and I'm going into that creepy dark basement. I'm there with my flashlight and the batteries are starting to go out. There's some weird dripping noise and something skittering through the shadows. An old box falls over and, an ancient book falls out and they open the pages and there's creepy diagrams on it. And I'm no longer Andrew so much as I am the character in the book who's now experiencing these things. And that's where my writer empathy really just kind of is like a 10 out of 10. And so, yeah, I absolutely get scared in those moments. My wife will sometimes say, like, I'm sitting up just absolutely rigid and kind of looking at the screen or my pen is going and I kind of get in a trance. So, yeah, I hope that answers your question. Absolutely.
That's great. It's just like when you're reading a book, you just feel like you're there.
Yeah, and I feel that those moments are they are those moments that you really need to listen to as a writer because they're joyous when they happen. They're unsettling when they happen too. And yeah, there's characters that I have and topics that have disturbed me. I can see the question down here. They've disturbed me and stopped, and I have stopped and put them away for a little while. But I feel that, like, as an author and as a horror author in particular, it is kind of my duty to push past being disturbed, and to kind of find out where that story goes. Because if it does disturb me, there might be something there that is going to scare other people. I don't write extreme or terribly violent stories and whatnot. So I don't think that I'm at the point where I'm just writing gore for gore's sake. I'd say, if you read Stephen King, you kind of know that I'm in the same ballpark of stuff that's going to happen in my books. Generally, when something does disturb me, I kind of feel like I'm at a good place to kind of really push past it and ask myself, why does that disturb me? Is there something good in the story there? And let's get excited. Let's put some new batteries in our flashlight and let's go explore that dark basement.
That's great. I've heard from another author that also talked about this and said that when they are writing a character, if they have to kill off the character, they do also feel grief
Mhm.
themselves?
Yeah, I definitely feel grief. I feel grief for my villains. I feel grief for all my characters in a way. I've got, a character in one of my techno thriller books who's essentially a serial killer, but I feel a sort of level of empathy for them. As awful as they are, I wouldn't want to spend the hundreds if not thousands of hours writing a story that they are a part of without kind of grieving for them. And yeah, absolutely, if it's a character that you're close to, man, if you're killing off your Dumbledore, you better be crying when that happens.
Hey, do you have any tips for aspiring authors?
I think just keep writing. Treat it. The best advice I ever got was from David Morrell. David Morrell wrote First Blood, which became the movie Rambo. He's written so many great books since. But if you've ever read the actual book First Blood and not the movies Rambo, they're very different. And it's a fantastic book. I encourage everyone to read it. I met David Morrell in 2019 at a conference in Nashville, and he gave this general advice to the audience. He said, if you treat it like an avocation, that's what it'll be. But if you treat it like a vocation, it will be a career. So if you treat it like a hobby, you're going to get hobbyist results. And if you treat it like a career, you will get career results. And that really means valuing your time. That means investing in yourself. That means buying as many books as you can, studying those books. Read a book the first time just for the story. But if you really like that book, go through it a second time with a highlighter. Start taking notes in the margins. Why did the author write the sentence like this? Why is this the first sentence of the book? Why is this the first sentence of every chapter? How do they change point of views? Start breaking the book down into the components. And some of my favorite books, I have like 3 versions of them because I have literally written notes in the side so much. Like my Silence of the Lambs books, I've got like 3 different versions of Silence of the Lambs on my bookshelf because the first one, I wrote so many damn notes in it that the highlighter started cracking through the pages. And I had to go back into that and to read the second one and to put some more notes. So treat it like any other thing that you are absolutely deadly serious about. Study it. It can be a hobby. There's nothing wrong with writing being a hobby, it being a way for you to just tell stories because you have fun. I do so many things in my life, like bicycling, that I just treat as a hobby. I love it. I get good exercise out of it. I get to go outdoors, but I'm not a professional cyclist. And if I were to be a professional cyclist, I would approach my cycling completely differently. So I think if you are writing, try to figure out what about it you can study to help improve your craft. And there's so many things that it can be overwhelming at the beginning. And there can be so many rules that people will tell you. But at the end of the day, the only rule is that you need to tell an entertaining story to the readers that you want to reach. I tell horror stories. They would probably not be good for someone who wants to sit down and read a cozy mystery. They would probably offer me feedback like, hey, you killed this character off too early, or I don't like this. So that's kind of where I learn to kind of contextualize the criticism. And if it's a person who only reads cozy mysteries and they're telling me that I should do X, Y, and Z differently in my story, then that's where I just learned that like they might not be the ideal reader for me. Thank you for spending your time with my words. I'll take that advice and I'll just kind of put it on the shelf and come back to it if I need to. So I think this all kind of goes back to like treat it as seriously as you want to be treated. If you are trying to be a writer, if you're trying to do this as a career, if you're doing this, if you want people to pay you money, if you want to have that money be enough for you to buy a house, a car, life, and to, support yourself and to pay taxes to the government on, really study it the way you would anything else. Whether it's computer programming, whatever it is, and put in the hours. And remember, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. It'll take a while to get there, but once you kind of start getting on that path, you're going to have so many skills in your toolbox that you're going to be able to use.
That's great. Thank you for the advice. And it looks
Thanks.
like we have several questions in comments. Do you find audiobooks give your books the right feel? Is it difficult to find a narrator? Do you have a big input?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel that audiobooks absolutely give a book the right feel. I am working with the same narrator I've worked with since my first audiobook. His name is Tom Jordan. He and I connected and I auditioned a bunch of different narrators. He is absolutely fantastic. He's who I consider the voice of all my books. I think that an audiobook, I actually listen to probably 80% of my reading is done on audiobooks. I have been listening to audiobooks since the early 90s when they came on cassettes. I do 4 out of 5 books that I consume are audio. And my Audible library is 400 plus books at this point. It's horrible. Yeah, I feel that audiobooks give them, a very important feel. Audiobook listeners are very different than readers. Readers tend to be people that will sit down and focus. Audiobook readers tend to be doing other things. They're driving somewhere. They're going on a bike ride. They're doing the dishes. I'm walking my dog. That's where I get a ton of my audiobook listening done. My poor dog is like, we're going around the neighborhood again, man. We've been doing this loop like 4 times. I'm like, yeah, but we're at the end of the book. I'm not going home. So you're just getting a long ass walk today. So yeah, I had a lot of input with my narrator. Tom Jordan is fantastic. And he and I worked, with every book we work on, we try to develop the voice of the characters. He sends me his ideas. He sends me his reading. I hear it and I, kind of give a little bit of feedback here and there. But it's not like, hey, you need to do this character in a different voice. It's more little things here and there. Just, kind of tuning the performances a tiny bit. But he's so good that at this point, it's really, I hear his voice as I am writing the near final drafts of my book. And I read all my books aloud as I'm rewriting them. That's another tip too, by the way, if you're trying to write a book, when you get to that revising stage, read your fucking book aloud. Excuse my French, but so many authors don't do that. They just look at the words on the page, but read your book aloud. Walk around with a pen. If you can't speak that sentence, other readers are going to struggle hearing that sentence. If you can't say that sentence, if there's too many commas in that sentence and you're kind of starting to get confused with where it's going, your readers are going to kind of tune out too. Sentences should be short. Some sentences can be long and have lots of clauses and be compounding and whatnot. So I think that having and working with an audiobook narrator is one of the biggest joys of this business. And it's upped my game, as a writer, as a publisher, it's been a delight, but as a writer, it's been a true joy. And I've become a better writer because of it.
That's awesome. And another question. Would you want your books turned into movies?
Sure. Yeah. I think any author who says they wouldn't want their books turned into a movie is lying at some level. I would love my books to be turned into a movie. I would prefer if the movie's really good. So that would be nice. As someone who did work in the film industry, the amount of time it takes to get a book through production or get any property, an original screenplay, an adaptation of a comic book, an adaptation of a video game, Barbie, something like that. It takes so long for it to get through development. So much money is tied up in that. There's so many egos involved in it as well. A director might come, a director might go. The producers, the executive producers, the people at the studio who are financing it, or if it's an independent film, the people who are putting up the money. So I would love to see my books on the screen. I don't know what form I would like to see them in. So if you look at a movie like Dune, for example, the David Lynch version of Dune from the 80s, I grew up watching that. I saw that and I loved it. And then I read the book and I was like, that was absolute rubbish. That movie was nothing like the book. I hated it. And so I went back and I hated it once I saw it afterwards. And then the Denis Villeneuve Dunes, I love because they're their own thing. They changed the book, but somehow they kept the heart of the book and the conflict of it. And I think that that's important. You have to remember it's an adaptation. It's not going to be a 1-for-1. I mean, even Lord of the Rings, they omitted entire sections of that book or made sections of the book that were a sentence into, an hour-long battle sequence, because it's a different medium entirely. So that's a roundabout way to say, yeah, sure, I'd love to see it. Even if it was a piece of trash, I'd love to see it. I'd love to see someone try it. And Head Like a Hole, I agree with that comment. If they could get that soundtrack, that would be a banger of a soundtrack too.
I would very much watch those movies myself as well. We have about 2 more questions before the end. Can you tell us about any upcoming projects you may be working on?
Sure. So I've got the second book in my series, Beyond the Lost Coast. The second book is Tides of Darkness. It comes out in July, I believe July 7th. Will be available in ebook, paperback, hardback, and an audiobook should be following about 60 days afterwards. It is a series, so I would suggest reading the first book. First book is By the Light of Dead Stars. It is cosmic horror meets coming of age. It's a supernatural ghost story on a small haunted town in Northern California. It's got the same vibe as Stranger Things, but it's not just all children, fighting monsters. There's an adult plot as well. There's a guy who's, in his mid-40s who moves back to take care of his niece, and he's never wanted kids his entire life. He's just been happy to be single and living in Spain, and he becomes a parental figure for this very precocious 13-year-old girl, and he's struggling as well to kind of figure out his life in this new town. So I'm really excited about that. I've got a couple other projects on the horizon as well after that that I'm not really able to say much about. I do have an alien horror novella coming out next year, I believe, with Crystal Lake, and I'm writing that with Gage Greenwood and John Durgan. The three of us are each doing about a 20 to 30,000 word novella in this anthology. So that should be a lot of fun. Alien horror is something that I've loved. So I'm going to be writing a really weird story. I think it's going to be the weirdest one I've ever written. But I think if you like my stuff, you're kind of used to weird at this point.
I love things that are weird, and like said before, I absolutely love aliens.
Thanks.
Oop, another question in the comments. Is it difficult to co-write?
Is it difficult to co-write? I'm not co-writing it with them, meaning we're not rewriting each other's stuff. We're all doing our own story that's going to be together under the umbrella of alien horror. So I shouldn't say I'm co-writing it with them. I have co-written things before, and yeah, it's difficult. I think both authors need to be in harmony and in agreement. It's like being in a band together or being in a duet, a barbershop group. I don't know. If you're not on the same page, if you don't have the same work ethic, you can have the same intention to tell the same story. But if one of you treats it professionally and the other treats it just like, hey, this is just something I'm going to do on the weekends for an hour here or an hour there, that gets old really quick. And as someone who really kind of tries to, buckle down every day and write every single day, it can really suck having a co-writer who doesn't treat it the same way. It can also be a challenge just because you might have two different solutions for how the story should end. Stories can have a sort of a variety of branches that they follow. And if, you're writing this direction and then they go on and change your character and have your character do something else, or have the character, sorry, it's not your character if you're co-writing, it's the group's character. But yeah, it can be a problem and it can be frustrating, and it can definitely make the process be a lot longer than it would be if you're doing it by yourself. It's like cooking a meal in a kitchen, right? If you're doing it by yourself, if you screw up the meal, it's on you. But if you've got another person in there, the two of you have to be in sync. Otherwise, yeah, it can get really frustrating. But when it works, it's really great. Co-writing can be awesome if it works, and if you're in the right headspace and they're in the right headspace and the stars align.
That makes sense. And we have our last question. So if anybody else wants to question in the comments, now is your time. And the last question is, where can we find your books?
You can find my books on my website, andrewvanwey.com, just like my name down at the bottom, AndrewVanwey.com. I'm on Amazon. My books are on Kindle. You can find them on Audible. You can find them in Barnes and Noble. Depending on the Barnes and Noble, you might find them in the store. Bookshop.org, you can order them. You should be able to order them at pretty much any store, even if they don't carry them on the shelf. Depending on how big the horror section is, you might not even have a horror section at the bookstore. On my website, I do sell signed copies from time to time. I think I've got a few in stock. So if you want a signed copy, I write those out and send them off, a couple times a week. But yeah, that's where you can find me, andrewvanway.com.
Awesome. And a comment. I loved Stephen King's book on writing, and he mentioned just what you did. Writing every day is so important. Would you ever write something like that?
I would not write that now because I feel that I do not have enough of my own lived experience to offer advice. Believe it or not, I was an English teacher in high school and in college in my 30s and up until the pandemic. I taught English at San Jose State University. I don't feel like I have enough momentum behind me to offer unique advice. I can offer advice that's worked for me. I can offer advice that I've read that has worked for other people. I think Stephen King's On Writing book is absolutely fantastic. And I've got a copy of it. Yeah, I think, oh yeah, here we go. Well, I don't want to back up too much or I'll pull my computer off the shelf. But yeah, I've got On Writing up there. It's absolutely fantastic. One of my favorite books. I think I've read it probably a dozen times at this point. There's great practical advice in there. And yeah, absolutely. He says, just treat it like a job every day. You've got to kind of go down into the basement and, people have this idea of their muse being this beautiful person that comes around and inspires you and brings you wine and cheese and plays the harp and gets you in the mood to sit down and write. But that's never been my experience. My experience has been like his, where the muse is, this person that you almost have to bribe. And, you have to kind of get the story out of them. And when you can get the story out of them, it's amazing. You can do some really cool work. But it is work at the end of the day. You got to sit your butt in the chair. You got to pound those keys or, pull that pen across the page and make the words come. And the nice thing about this is that first draft is just a first draft. You can go back again and again and again, but that's the work part of it.
Awesome. And that was the last question. So we are done here. And I had a great time meeting with you. This has been very insightful. Thank you to everyone in the chat who has been asking questions as well.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you spending your time with my words and listening to me. And thank you very much for this opportunity. This was a lot of fun.
No problem. Bye to life.
Bye.